absolutely delighted to have you with us here today, Arne, and to hear your thoughts on the drivers of Chinese foreign policy. Welcome.
Thanks, Taylor. It's great to be here, virtually at least. It would be much better to be with you in person, and I hope we can do that soon. And repeat the second part of this discussion with me coming up to Boston to see you there. So I'm going to speak for about 25 minutes or so on the drivers of Chinese foreign policy, the way I see this now, and it is intended to be food for thought and not least food for discussion. So I'm really looking forward to discussing this with all of you, because it is a critical issue. I mean, a lot of people, increasing number of people, have very strong opinions about PRC foreign policy. But I think in terms of discussing the drivers of that policy, we are still inadequately equipped, whether we approach it from an historical angle, as I do, or whether we approach it through the social sciences. I still think that we have some way to go to try to understand what drives Chinese foreign policy at this particular point. So my starting point, which wouldn't be everyone's starting point, is that PRC foreign policy has changed a lot over the past decade. So there is significant change. I would agree, as some of our friends have written, both in history and political science, that there are continuities. There certainly isn't a break-off point about a decade ago that makes what we have studied earlier on in terms of China's foreign policy, even before the PRC period, irrelevant to what we're looking at today. In terms of issues, as would be the case with any country, there are continuities. There are continuities in terms of some of the approaches, not least in terms of the diplomatic and security practices. But there has also been a lot of change. So I'm on the change side of that equation. I think we are looking at change that we have to explain. So in that sense, what I'm going to go on saying addresses that question of change. Then the next issue is, of course, what does this change consist of? So I think it comes in different parts. I think it consists of a more assertive foreign policy, assertive being a term here chosen with some care. A more assertive foreign policy, especially within the region, but also towards the United States, Australia, Canada, Europe, India. You can see it in a lot of different contexts. You see it in economic issues, you see it in border issues, historical issues, and of course, as Taylor and others have pointed out recently, anything connected to sovereignty in the broadest sense gets very significant attention from the PRC leadership. So there is a turn towards a more assertive foreign policy, I would argue, on a broad set of issues. The broader set of issues than had been the case, I think, at any point in the past of PRC foreign policy since the late 1970s. But there is also a substantial change in the language of foreign affairs, and I think language matters on these kinds of issues, and maybe particularly in the situation that we are in at the moment. And the kind of terminology that's very often chosen by today's rulers in China underline China's unique experience under the PRC. It stresses China's successes relentlessly, but it also stresses the failures of others. It's remarkable to see, if you compare, as we have some people here at Yale who are doing, the main outlets for Chinese news at the central level now and a decade ago, how often the failures of others on issues such as COVID, but also going much further than that, are underlined today. While a decade ago you'd find much more reticence on that. You also find more reticence on lauding China's own successes. But to me, one of the things that stands out is the readiness to critique the failures of others as a way of reflecting in a positive sense on China's own situation and development. So language matters on these kinds of things. And then thirdly, and connected to my two first points in terms of what the change consists of, is the PRC tendency these days to react almost hysterically to any perceived slight or insult. Now, this we have seen before in Chinese foreign policy. I mean, in the 1960s, maybe especially, this was also a much practiced approach to how to deal with international affairs. But we haven't seen much of it since. Today, it's really coming to the fore. It almost seems, I was joking with some Chinese colleagues in a discussion I had with friends in Shanghai this morning, that both the Central Committee and the Foreign Ministry seem to have particular units that are constantly on the lookout for perceived slights or insults against the PRC, and then to take action directly or indirectly in countering those or dealing with those. And sometimes vastly over-representing the kind of insult that they are supposed to have been subjected to. That's new if you think about the last generation of Chinese foreign policy, and could be said not to be, as I will return to later on, the best way of conducting foreign policy overall, particularly not with your neighbors. So the question then becomes, for the rest of my 25 minutes, what drives this change? And of course, there are different causes. I will argue that some of them work reasonably well together, and they're easier to explain together as part of an overall pattern now than I would say only a few years ago. But before getting to those, I think it is important to stress that most of what we see, in my view, is driven from above. It's driven by the CCP elite in its various incarnations, and shifts and changes that have taken place there in terms of the perception, not just of the outside world, but of China as well. There is a sense that domestic market reform and accommodation to the US-led international system had gone too far. I think you noticed that already before Xi Jinping became leader of the party and leader of the state. But of course, it's during his time in power that it has really come to the fore. It's not just something, in my view, and this is important, that has been taken on as a way of confronting US foreign policy aims that China disagrees with or finds threatening. It's a much deeper reaction than that. It is a sense that some of the policy that had been developed all the way since the late 70s and early 80s was now out of whack and needed to be corrected. And there is the link between the domestic and the international that to me is crucial on this. So the sense of the need to make a correction, rein in market forces at home, and step away from the accommodation policy with regard to the United States. And this correction has then set off countermeasures on the US side, not very surprisingly. Now, no one, not even the Chinese, could expect Donald Trump to be elected US president, but some of the connections are still there with regard to the way China, the PRC, reacted to US initiatives in the last administration of Barack Obama. So I think there is even a connection with regard to that. As the confrontation between the two sides increased, it produced a more hardline Chinese policy and also helped deliver Donald Trump as US president. So some of the US perceptions, since we mentioned Trump, to me seem a massive overreaction to what's been going on the US side. And we can talk about that in the discussion afterwards. But they are not just developments that are connected, as some people would argue, to what is happening inside the United States itself. They are also reactions to very significant shifts that have been going on the Chinese side in the direction of what I've already observed. Now, on the domestic side, and to me this has become increasingly interesting in the discussion about the development of Chinese foreign policy. On the domestic side, I think it's quite noticeable that in the early part of the period we're talking about now, roughly speaking, the last decade, there was a rising sense, which was shared by a lot of people, not just by the CCP elites I'm talking about here, of the challenges of the kind of market development that China had chosen becoming more visible and more burdensome. A lot of people were talking about increasing chaos, problems in terms of governing. Very often that's a view that, of course, comes from the party elites and the government elites itself. Governance was harder than what it had been in the past. Corruption was a particular issue that signaled, as it has earlier in Chinese history, at least in the view of the people I'm talking about now, a sense of a real problem at the center, a deterioration of party values, the kind of values that the parties assumed to have stood for in its early years. A lot of this very clearly expressed even before Xi Jinping was elected General Secretary. Problems in terms of inequality, that more and more people became social and economic inequality, more and more people became preoccupied with. Unplanned growth, some of you will have followed that debate in terms of China's economic affairs from the 2000s onwards. And of course, foreign influence. So a fear that China was getting increasingly controlled by outsiders, some of them, of course, Chinese, who are not PRC citizens, but still, regarded in this sense as being foreign. That is was a real challenge. It reduced the ability of the party to govern within China itself. So in that sense, to me, and I think this is important, and I'll return to it right at the end, Xi Jinping is in many ways representative of some of these broader trends. Not all of the answers could have been thought out in the early 2010s, but some of the questions and the issues were there long before Xi Jinping became the head of and his leadership group became the heads of the party. And of course, also on the domestic side, which I think contributes quite critically to the kind of mood that we find in Beijing on foreign policy today, the sense that the party benefited from a set of successes during Xi's time in power, not least its response to the global pandemic, to COVID-19, but also other issues that were seen as being more beneficial for people in general than what had been the case during the roaring 2000s, if you should call them that, in China prior to Xi coming to power. So that domestic background to me goes well together with some of the issues that we want to discuss with regard to foreign policy and should not be seen as separate from them. Then turning to the region, the larger Eastern Asian region, which to me is the main area for Chinese foreign policy and the main area of concern, I think, for everyone else, including first and foremost, of course, people who live in that region. I think you've seen rather dramatic changes over the decade that I've been talking about now. An increase in the PRC perception of centrality with regard to the region. I mean, that's always been there. I think I've written about this on a number of occasions. It's not something that is introduced, of course, with the PRC, and certainly not the party's new leadership. But the essence of this, the continuous harping on this, the perception within the party leadership, easily expressed, of that centrality is much stronger now than what it has been for some time. Connected, I think, to some of the issues that I've already mentioned. And that leads to an expectation that other countries conform to PRC interests in a way that we hadn't seen, certainly during the reform era, but probably not really in any meaningful way during any of the existence of the PRC up to now. So Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, all the small countries, as Jiang Jiechi likes to talk about, are supposed to conform, at least at a relatively high level, to what the interests of the center, meaning China, actually are in this context. And we've seen it on a whole number of issues. We've seen it, of course, most closely on border issues, but we also see it on security issues. Think about Korea in this context. We see it on the South China Sea set of issues. As all of you will know, it's not just about confrontation. I mean, there is a carrot and stick approach with regard to this, particularly with regard to South Korea and Southeast Asia. Less so, at least up to now, with regard to Japan. But it changes from what you could call the Deng Xiaoping approach to these countries and these areas is distinct and very clear. And for people within the regions themselves, quite menacing. The most problematic case, of course, is Taiwan, very much in the news and very much on my mind these days. I worry about the relationship between the PRC and Taiwan in a way that they haven't done for a long while. And this is driven, I think, almost exclusively by changing perceptions on the PRC side. When I was last long-term in Beijing in 2019, it was noticeable that a lot of the people I spoke to who are connected to the current administration in Beijing like to underline the need to, using terms like setting things in order with regard to Taiwan. And when I pushed on what that meant, it was creating a better relationship, of course, but it was clear that it was creating a better relationship between the two. Baked into that, there had to be on rules and regulations different from what they are now set by the PRC. So even that has been a longer term process, but I do think that what we are seeing now is of a somewhat different order from what we've seen before with regard to Taiwan. And it would be interesting to discuss that after the talk. With regard to the United States, I think it is important to note that, of course, China's policy towards this country is driven by US policies since 9/11. I think much of the Chinese fear of the United States, which is very distinct, was created after 9/11 when the United States started its invasions, interventions, occupations in the Middle East. A much more unilateral foreign policy than what one had seen before. And this really frightened leaders in Beijing that they could be at the receiving end of a US foreign policy that was much more aggressive towards the outside world. But that goes along with a sense in Beijing that the US hold on the international system is weakening. So this is one of these cases where you can, in a way, have it both ways with regard to understanding different sentiments that drive Chinese foreign policy. On the one hand, there is the fear of US interventionism and capabilities. On the other hand, there is the sense that the United States, particularly after the global financial crisis in the late 2000s, that the US hold on the international system is weakening. One of the things that really struck me when I was in Beijing last for a longer period of time was in one discussion, which was actually out at the Zhongyang Yenshikoshi at the Central Military Academy, where some of the colonels who were there drew comparisons between the United States and the Soviet Union on its last legs. And many of you will know that that Chinese elites are obsessed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But this came out in a slightly different way from what I expected. It wasn't China that was compared to the Soviet Union, it was the United States. And with the idea being, as one of them expressed it, that just like the Russians did the Soviet Union in, it's now the Americans who are doing in the international system that they themselves had created. I found that comparison that was similarly very interesting in terms of the perception of American policies. And then finally, on the issue of nationalism, I was just having another discussion here at Yale this morning with Jennifer Pan from Stanford, who's visiting, on the drivers of what we may call, with a slightly difficult term, Chinese nationalism. I think it makes sense now to talk about a kind of PRC nationalism driven by perceptions of Chinese strength. This is obviously what the party itself is aiming at. It wants a kind of, I mean, it's not the best phrase to use, but a kind of civic nationalism. It certainly doesn't want to have much connection to the Chinese or Han nationalism that is so prevalent in more popular terms within the PRC. What it wants to do is to create a PRC nationalism that is intimately connected to the founding of the new Goa, the new state, the new nation in 1949, and the idea that Chinese strength has been created by the party. So it's a complex kind of nationalism, but I do find it to be really significant. We can discuss how significant it is. I mean, how much of future policy will be determined by these trends. And of course, the ever-present question, how much of this is simply a creation of CCP elites from above, and maybe particularly, as in what Mao Zedong is supposed to have said, that nationalism only serves you that far, that it's like riding the tiger, and if you fall off, it will eat you alive. So there are those aspects of the debate about the party's use of nationalism within China. But I think in terms of the kind of definition that I tried to make of it, it is strong, it's prevalent, and it's probably increasing in terms of significance for how PRC foreign policy is carried out. So just to conclude then, Taylor, with the focus on the party leader, Xi Jinping himself, leadership always matters in foreign policy. And you could argue that it matters in particular in China because of its authoritarian traditions in terms of policy, but maybe particularly foreign affairs. So I see Xi, as a Chinese friend put it recently, as a leader who takes party consensus views to extremes, or at least he does so sometimes. He doesn't create, I think, much of the party's views on policy in general, not even on foreign affairs. He is representative very much of the views that his generation and the generation slightly younger than his expresses with regards to these issues at the top levels of the parties. But sometimes, driven by circumstance, I would argue, it's his leadership group who is willing to take some of these consensus views to extremes in terms of, going back to what I said earlier on, of how to counter what is seen as slights or insults against China, but also this relentless emphasis on China's successes and the failures of others. And of course, the general underlining of the need to strike back immediately on anything that is seen as a threat to the concept of PRC sovereignty. So I think I'll end it there, Taylor, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. All right. Thanks so much. Lots of food for thought on the table. So with our hybrid setup, I want to invite everyone on the Zoom. Please raise your hand in the Zoom, and I'll be looking for that. And then everyone in the room, please raise your hands like high above your ears. Let's see. I see Eleanor first. So Eleanor, you've got the first question. Everyone else, keep your hands up.
Do I go up to the mic or should I just say it?
Just speak loudly from where you are, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you for that very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you a question about Chinese elite politics. You mentioned this as being one of the drivers of Chinese foreign policy, and particularly changing dynamics with regard to the Politburo Standing Committee. So as you know, after Mao Zedong, there was an effort to institutionalize Chinese politics at the elite levels, in particular, a norm of collective leadership, age retirement limits, term limits, that kind of thing. And I think under Xi Jinping, we've seen some rollback of those things. And so I wanted to ask you if Xi Jinping remains in power at the Party Congress next year, which I think many people expect will be the case. Do you anticipate that there will be a return to a more volatile domestic elite politics in China, perhaps more factionalism, as was the case under Mao Zedong, for example? And would you expect that volatility to express itself in the foreign policy arena, or would it be limited more to a domestic audience? Thanks.
It's a really good question, but it's also a very difficult question to answer in any meaningful way. I think there's no doubt that Xi Jinping is going to continue as Chinese leader after the Congress, and for the foreseeable future. I think everything has been put in place for that to happen. I also know that is controversial. I mean, even among people who, broadly speaking, would support his policy line, and certainly would share many of the concerns that I talked about in the first part of my talk, with regard to where China's problems are and the direction you should move in to try to resolve them. But I do think that experience in the past, not least under the leadership of the CCP, has noted that there is a problem if personalized leadership is going to go on for too long. It's possible that will be resolved within the next Congress, so not this coming Congress, but on the road to the next one, the next Central Committee. I'm not sure if that will be the case. And I do have a sense that if there is another party Congress and she is re-elected in the same way, at that Congress, I'm not sure if there might not be at least some trouble within the party. I mean, there were people already last time when I was in China who in private, and these are not sort of dissidents, these are solid party members, who reminded me and everyone else present about Leonid Brezhnev and his sad demise as a Soviet leader. I think, of course, this will depend to some extent on the policy outcomes, on the policies chosen by he and his leadership group. There will be less controversy with regard to this if the going is good. If there is a general sense that China is making progress. I think if there is any sense that is not happening, there is bound to be somewhere along the line trouble with regard to this. So I think my main message with regard to your question is that one should be very careful with seeing the abolition of any kind of not just formal term limits, but thinking about leadership for life, which is really the issue here. That one should be very careful with seeing that as unproblematic in a CCP context, even now.
Thanks. Next, Carol Savitz. Carol.
Yeah, Arne, you mentioned the collapse of the Soviet Union, but you really didn't talk about Russia and Chinese views of Russia as China's looking out over the Pacific and East Asia and everything. And as a Russianist, there's a debate in my field about whether or not this is really a strategic alliance and this new partnership between Russia and China. What does it mean? What's the depth? What does Russia get out of it? And there are a lot of people who feel, well, China is at some point going to eat Russia's lunch, whether it's in Central Asia or elsewhere. So I'd really like to hear your views or your interpretation of the elite views on the utility of that alliance with Russia.
I'd be very interested in hearing your views on this as well. We can push back on that a little bit later on. But here's mine for what it's worth. So I think so far there is a sense within the wider leadership group that relations with Russia have developed well, from a Chinese perspective. I think at the beginning of the decade, when this close relationship was sort of starting to evolve, I think there were very significant concerns that came out of troubles in the past, but also this sense that Russia could turn out to be a fickle friend. The sense that Russia, after all, is a European origin country and would use China to try to get some kind of deal with regard to the United States and Europe, which is where its real attention would be. I see much less of that now. I think there is a sense that China has handled this well. There is also a sense that Russia doesn't really, by its own design or lack thereof, have anywhere else to go. That this is maybe not the greatest love affair in international politics, but it is a relationship created out of necessity on the Russian side, as much, if not more, than out of aspirations and access to both political support and resources on the Chinese side. I think people who look at this, particularly from within the party leadership group, more than in the foreign ministry or even in the military, are very watchful of signs that there might be any kind of trouble brewing in the relationship. I think the concern about Russian overreach, a keen understanding in China of Russian weakness, I think all of that is there. I think the Russian involvement in Syria set off alarm bells in Beijing, not because they thought it was necessarily a bad thing to rescue the Assad regime, but because they were worried that it would lead to a new kind of conflict, not just with the United States and with the West, but also with significant parts of Arab nationalism. And the fact that the Russians have gotten away with that, more or less scot-free, is something that has helped convince leadership groups or predominant groups within Chinese foreign policy making that the pseudo-alliance, the close relationship with Russia is something that will be, even in the foreseeable future, in China's interest. So I think there is a little element of surprise within the leadership in Beijing with regard to this, that it worked out all that well. But now it is established in a way that I think leads into the future. There's a lot of strategic thinking in Beijing about how to build and how to keep a long-term strategic relationship with Russia in place, even on issues that could be contentious, such as, say, Mongolia or Central Asia. There is a sensitivity to Russian interests and Russian concerns with regard to that region that is more noticeable now. That might be seen to be a kind of victory for Putin, I don't know. But we hear it more often sort of expressed. Now, if this in any way would come up against some of the issues that I discussed earlier on in terms of basic Chinese approaches to its leadership role with regard to its neighbors, it might be tested. But that has not been the case so far, and there is an increased sensitivity to what it would cost to work closely with Russia, even with regard to these regions.
Carol, would you like to add anything from the Russian perspective?
I think Arne hit on something. I think the Russians do feel that at the moment they have no place else to go. The question that was always in the back of my mind is, if things got tough with Taiwan or in the South China Sea, does Russia really want to be involved and have to support its new ally in terms of some kind of Chinese mess or whatever it might turn out to be? Conversely, does Russia's really been supporting separatism in any number of the post-Soviet states, which is something that seems to me would be anathema to the Chinese in terms of Xinjiang and some of the other separatist areas in China. So they really can't support Russia either. So I guess my question is, what are the limits of this great rapprochement between Russia and China? Because in some ways, fundamentally, they really don't agree on a lot.
Yeah. But that's exactly right. Exactly right. And I think this is one of the reasons why we have to watch the sort of individual issues as they come up with regard to that relationship. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I was in Beijing during two of the Ukrainian crises, including the takeover of Crimea, and you could see the visible discomfort from some of the people I spoke to after having extolled the friendship between the Chinese and Russian peoples, with the kind of action that Russia took in dismembering a sovereign state. Then became even worse with the Russian support for ethno-nationalism in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass area. And I think that's an issue where I would be very surprised when we actually get to these materials in the archives and get to understand this from the inside, whether we wouldn't find that there were clear Chinese warnings with regard to what, pardon me, what Russia ought to do on the issue of Ukraine in general. I don't think there were specific prescriptions from Chinese perspective in terms of Russian actions in the Donbass, but I think there were expressed views from China with regard to issues of sovereignty with regard to Ukraine.
Yeah, and on the broader point, I don't know of any time, even at the height of the Sino-Soviet alliance, that Moscow was willing to back Beijing on the sovereignty dispute.
Yeah,
This is
that's of course another, yeah.
a long-standing reluctance. I want to turn to the Zoom now and ask Diana to come on and ask her question. Diana, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Taylor. And thank you for the talk. I just want to go back to your, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. I just want to go back to the beginning of your discussion where you brought up the 3 points of changes in China's overall policy discourse, which are they're more assertive, they address more success of their own people and other failures of others, and take insults more seriously. My question is, how much do you think these changes are just narratives? Or do you think that they actually reflect a more hawkish or hostile stance of China in its approach to foreign affairs? And relating to your latter point on China trying to foster a sense of nationalism and the phenomenon that these rhetorics that you mentioned, these changes are actually more present domestically in the domestic discourse to a broader domestic audience, how much of these changes are directed for a inward domestic oriented audience, or are they more foreign oriented?
Well, those are 2 good questions. I think on the former, I do think that the rhetoric reflects the reality in terms of how the leadership group or groups that I was talking about see China's relationship with the rest of the world. I think so. This is one of the reasons why I want us to pay attention to language, right? Because if there's one thing that we learned from much of 20th century history on this particular area, it is that how leaderships express matters is actually significant in terms of understanding where they're coming from. Not in the sense that they, would reflect anything that and everything that goes on, within the leaderships themselves. So it's not a question of sort of truthfulness of representation that I'm after, but it is that very often we find regimes that express themselves in ways that are pretty close to their actual perception of how affairs have developed. And I think China today is no exception to that. I think the kind of rhetoric that is being used is more or less an accurate reflection of the concerns and the perceptions that are being raised within the leadership. Sometimes exaggerated, as getting to the second part of your question, for domestic purposes, or sometimes even for foreign purposes. So I think some of the, what I like to call it hysteria in terms of Chinese pushback on perceived slights and insults, it's definitely connected to shoring up domestic support for various points of view. Anything that can be presented as an insult to the Chinese as a people, is particularly, is particularly easy to use within China itself. Jennifer Pan was telling me this morning about some of the survey research that she has done, which shows that when an issue is presented as an issue of an insult to the Chinese, the connection, at least in her research, to then not just acceptance but active support of Chinese government views is much stronger than if it is seen as a general international affairs or foreign policy difference. So I think that the nationalism in this context matters a great deal. I think it is in part domestic consumption. I just think we have to be very careful with believing that it's driven by an overall increase in nationalism within Chinese society. I think this is being played, sometimes played well and sometimes played badly by the CCP, based on attitudes and views that are already in existence, but are then exploited for very distinct political purposes.
Nick Hacker.
Hey, Arne, it's good to see you. I had a quick question about to what extent do you believe that this behavioral shift serves China's long-term national interests, which I interpret loosely as, the continued survival of the CCP and the maintenance of China's territorial integrity. And I can see this kind of cross-cutting both ways. On the one hand, Avery Goldstein had a good article, and I asked a couple of years ago about his sense that if you go out looking for trouble, you're going to find it. And, obviously the United States has learned this arguably better than any other great power, and that the Chinese have been watching our adventures very closely. On the other hand, we're not seeing the kinds of at least external balance of behavior in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, to a certain extent with Korea and Japan. And depending on how cynical you are, you might argue that there's nothing to be done, and that you can internally, amplify your Coast Guard and build up weapon systems, but it's over. And so I was curious, do you think that the strategy is going to work for China in the long term, or will there be some kind of a pushback?
Yeah, good to see you too, Nick. I think there will be consequences, as there always is, when a rising power starts to misbehave and throw its weight around. And of course, as you indicated in your question, China is not the first, nor will it be the last power to behave in that kind of way with regard to its own region. So if you ask Mexicans and Canadians, I'm doing a project now on 19th century imperialisms. If you ask them about US behavior, of course, you would find much of the same concern, certainly going back to that time period. So how does it work? I think the outcome with regard to the region will very much depend on the next decade. I think the next decade really in China's relationship with the region that it's part of will be critical. So if there is a sense that some degree of cooperation, particularly in economic terms, can be rescued out of this, particularly in a world where economic cooperation on a global scale might be harder to find, then I think that in spite of its strong emphasis on its leadership role and on its sovereign rights, widely inflated, that China would be able to have more of a gradual development towards becoming the predominant power in regional terms. If that doesn't happen, so if there is a sense that China is using its strategic and military capabilities in order to put pressure on everyone around it, I think there will be a reversal within the region to looking for allies and support elsewhere. First and foremost, of course, from the United States. We're already seeing some examples of that. But also for regional powers to join up much more in confronting what is seen as a Chinese threat. And I think the critical moment for that decision is in a way now. So we've seen what happened in Hong Kong, and the region has seen what's happened in Hong Kong. It is true, as a lot of people I had in a discussion with Singapore said last week, that Hong Kong is, after all, however much we sympathize, an internal Chinese issue. Yes, but the kind of measures that's taken by Beijing is they are, of course, noticed by everyone else. The kind of methods are then being thought of with regard to what could happen to others next. And that's not just true for Taiwan, which of course is the possible one in terms of the expansion of actual PRC concepts of sovereignty. It's also true for other countries within the region. So this is where I really sense failure in many ways on the PRC side, Nick. That there is a sense in Beijing that China has more time than what it actually has in managing, ameliorating the relationship with its neighbors. the idea is so often expressed, and I'm sure many of you have heard this as well, as China's rise continues, countries surrounding China will have more and more of an interest in adjusting their own policies and adjusting not least their economic framework to that of China. I don't believe that's true. I don't think there is that much time available. I think these countries, not least in terms of what's happened over the past 2 to 3 years and what is happening now with regard to Taiwan, are looking at decisions taken now in Beijing and will readjust their own policies. Sometimes, I wouldn't be surprised, in a rather dramatic manner, based on how they see the outcome of these Chinese policies.
If I could push you a little bit more here, Arne, I mean, the drivers, as you lay them out, suggest or portray a China that can't really course correct, that can't really moderate nearly as much as it was able to do in the past. And so you've seen China alienate Europe to a significant degree with sanctions and everything earlier in the year. The crumbling or the beginnings of the crumbling of the 16 or 17 plus one, the complete overextension with India, even if it was sensitive and sovereignty, to the point where many Indian commentators sort of view that as a point of no return, kind of, and so on and so forth. But all the dynamics here will only reinforce that, because criticism, especially over sovereignty, will let China further arch its back. These are principled positions of the party, upon which, as you know, Xi takes the extreme consensus view. And so there's very little room for any of the kind of statecraft that previous leaders, even perhaps sometimes maybe even the Mao, were able to sort of exercise on China's behalf. And so I guess a different reading is that we are on a collision course, because the drivers, as you lay them out, are ones that will be self-reinforcing, in the sense of encouraging China to double down on what causes discomfort in other countries, and an inability really to respond in a way you might expect other powers still wanting to sort of ascend to respond.
So I don't think we are past the point of no return with regard to Chinese foreign policy, but I agree with you that we are, as I said in my last comment, that we are getting pretty close to it, at least as far as the region is concerned, and possibly even further afield. And of course, I worry intensely about that. I know, we all know, that there are alternative views on China's role in the world that exist even within the Chinese Communist Party. But building on what you just said, Taylor, I think, it will need that there has to be quite a sharp and intense shock to the system for these to come to the forefront. And what that would be is of course what worries me the most. The most benign version of it that I can imagine is a sharp economic downturn. I don't think it's very likely, but I think it is possible. There are some structural weaknesses in the Chinese economy, some of which we are seeing right now, that might harm the party's approach so far to international affairs. But I wouldn't bet on it. More likely, if there is to be a shock, I think it has to be some kind of external event that goes sharply against the PRC's own interests as defined by the party. I think one of the big challenges for Xi and his leadership group is the personal focus that is on him, and to lesser extent on them, with regard to everything that goes on in and around China. I mean, there is a with great power comes great responsibility, but also great attention to things that could really go wrong. So Xi has nailed his colors to the mast with regard to the current assertive foreign policy. And if there is seen to be very significant setbacks to that, I'm also pretty sure that that he and the group he represents would be the ones to blame inside the party. So on that, it's a slightly different point. I mean, we have to be very careful with this. I mean, there is a public discourse in this country now that is starting to present the PRC almost as a personal dictatorship under Xi Jinping, which I think is entirely wrong. He is a powerful general secretary, but he serves on behalf of the party elites. And if there are signs that what he represents would be a real danger to the only thing that these people really, really are preoccupied with, which is the continued rule of the party over China, I think he could be in very, very serious trouble. So, let's not go too far with this idea that everything can be controlled or managed by a Xi Jinping leadership. As long as the going is good, yeah. But when things turn difficult, probably not.
Thanks. Next, Dick Samuels.
Thanks, Taylor. Thanks, Arne. In a way, I'm following Carol's question and a bit Nick's as well, your answer to Nick, but not from Moscow, but from Tokyo. So, in recent months, it will not have gone unobserved that there's been a significant hardening of Japanese leadership claims about the importance of Taiwan to Japanese national security, a hardening of Japanese public opinion, contrary to, in opposition to Chinese behavior. And that was an Abe-Suga sort of continuum. But now you have a new prime minister, and he just gave you a phone call, and he said, Arne, what should I do? How can I best approach my number one trading partner and try to find space where we can navigate these very dangerous shoals going forward?
Japan is in a difficult position with regard to all of this, because as you indicate, much of Japan's continued prosperity is now linked up with China in a way that goes beyond what is true even for other countries within the region. I do think that the advice that I would give the incoming prime minister is, of course, to try to, in the best way possible, to balance that relationship with a strong security relationship with the United States while building relations with other countries within the region. It's very difficult to do. I mean, it's what his predecessors have tried to do with, as you know better than anyone, with very mixed results. I do think it is important for Japan to react with regard to issues that are not simply connected to the Sino-Japanese sphere. I think one of the mistakes that previous Japanese governments have made is that they have tried to insulate Japan's bilateral relationship with China from whatever else is happening in the region. That can no longer, I think, be the case. I think that goes for, most obviously for Korea. But I think it also to some extent goes for Taiwan, obviously within a framework that has already been set for Japan, for the way Japan expresses its concern with regard to Taiwan. But, particularly a new Japanese prime minister certainly has ways in which it could be conveyed very clearly to Beijing that there are consequences of China's behavior with regard to Taiwan as well. So it is a difficult balance that needs to be struck. There is also the balance, of course, as the Japanese now have learned, not least in the previous US administration, of managing the US alliance so that Japan is not left exposed, which is the big concern, not these days, not least within the LDP. And that's another issue, I think, which the new Japanese prime minister and his government will have to handle. So, if I were to do my 5 minutes or 2 minute elevator pitch, I think that issue of trying to balance this is the key message. It has been the message, of course, that Japanese prime ministers have been hearing for some time. But I think the problem for Japan has been that there hasn't really been a thought out strategy for how to try to handle this. It's been much more reactive than what I would have liked to see. And frankly, I don't expect that to change very much with the new government coming in.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, that balance has been on the front of people's foreheads in Japan for a very long time. It's getting the distance just right between the United States in relative decline and a rising China, getting that right. They've been talking about it now for a decade or more, but there has been the bargaining, the hardening, the statement that Taiwan is by Deputy Defense Minister
Yes.
most recently, that Taiwan is a matter of national security for Japan. It's a central matter, it's a red line. By a former prime minister said the same thing or something equivalent to it. The defense statement, the defense report of Japan said the same thing. So if the prime minister said specifically to you, should I accept Chinese application or support Chinese application to the CPTPP, would that be a way to try to balance if they're going to continue a tougher, more muscular stance on the military side and the alliance with the United States? Would you say, yes, that's a good idea, or no, that's a bad idea?
I think at the moment, it would be really hard for a Japanese government, for reasons that you know, to be seen as the one that is blocking Chinese membership of China's application. I think there will be, and there is, a lot of discussion going on between various parts of the Japanese elite in terms of how this should actually be done, in terms of conditions, conditionalities. But I think an outright no from Tokyo on this issue would be seen as being far too disruptive to the relationship overall. I think there is more, I mean, going back to your point about Taiwan, I think, and you're absolutely correct in saying that, you know, this has been stressed now much more directly than it has for a very long time in the past. I think this is more the way to go. I mean, I think it is to link issues that has to do with the bilateral relationship between China and Japan and the multilateral aspects, not least in terms of institutions that both China and Japan operate in, with specific Japanese concerns about China's foreign policy behavior. But I don't think that in sort of in overall terms to be seen as trying to isolate China economically, certainly not initiated by Japan, would be the right way to go.
Thanks. I'm gonna go back to the Zoom. Wright Smith, over to you, Wright. Oh, you're muted, right?
Am I still muted? I thought I.
There we go. Here you go.
Can hear you. Yeah, now we can hear you.
Thank you so much. So, I've been paying some attention to what seemed to my mind at least to be the fairly significant moves that the Chinese government has been making over the past 6 months, the past year or so, to tackle for lack of a better term, the issue of income inequality and to rein in the actions of various different industries in one form or another. So the tutoring industry, and now potentially Evergrande and the real estate industry. And so my question in a bit of a roundabout way is, do you think there's the possibility that in cracking down on industries in one form or another, that the leadership might chill the investment environment in China to such a degree that it disincentivizes Western investment and that thus might contribute to the possible decoupling that we were talking about sort of at the outset of the COVID pandemic? And if that's the case, what would be the consequences of that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you can see some elements of that already happening. I mean, you don't just see it with regard to foreign investments into China, you see it with regard to Chinese investments in China and the willingness of people including financial institutions, that I would have expected to be lent upon much more directly by the party, to be more forward in terms of how they dispose other people's money. But even they are holding back, right? Because they don't know where the next crackdown is going to come. And this is a problem. I mean, my assumption is that there is some kind of plan within the party leadership for how far this is going to go, at least in this round. I think there might be, as rectifications go in general, there's always a second round planned of it, right, at some point in the future. So I think there are limits at this point. But it is having just the effect that you mentioned with regard to the investment climate overall. I also think there is a lot of sort of second guessing happening, not just among people in finance, about which sector is going to be next. It's going to be health sector, is it going to be, some people even say the clean energy sector, is up there as one that could possibly be criticized. So going to the core of the question, I mean, some of it is driven by concerns that is happening in a broader sense, as I said, with regard to inequality, with regard to corruption, with regard to the enormous power of the big companies, especially perhaps within the tech sector, which is the case, of course, elsewhere as well. But in other sectors, in addition to that, as we already see, so someone just said in the chat that the health sector chilling is already happening. I think that is true, but this is beginning, right? So, we can see that some of this is driven by concerns that have a wider resonance in Chinese society and certainly within the party at the lower levels. The problem is how far you will be able to drive this with, under banners such as common prosperity and combating inequality. I think for a lot of people, not least people, ordinary Chinese who invested their money in these companies, their conclusion will be that this is mainly about the party of the power, the power of the party, the ability of the CCP to govern absolutely all sectors of Chinese society, including the economy. And I have a suspicion, maybe not in this round, right, because they have chosen so far their targets relatively carefully. But in the next round, that this could lead to a lot of very awkward questions being asked of where China is actually moving. And that's, of course, one of the big issues that we have to think about as well. I mean, there are people who are saying this is a correction within a market-driven economy. Others are saying no. I mean, this is turning towards a completely new level of state control and state involvement, state running of very significant parts of the Chinese economy overall. Then, of course, there are those who are saying, well, we say that because we only seen the surface of what is happening. This has always been the case. I'm doubtful of that argument, particularly over the past decade or possibly even decade and a half. I mean, knowing a little bit about what goes on in the Chinese corporate sector, I do think that some of these points that are being made about the distance that had developed between some of these and what the party really wanted to see done, I think that discrepancy, that distance, commenting on that is actually correct. So that there is an adjustment going on now. There is a very different direction being taken. How far it's going to go, no one knows.
Thanks. Raymond Vaughn.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. I'm a third year in the program, and I have a very simple question. So most of the changes you identified, growing assertiveness, changing in types of language used, it all deals with the how of China is pursuing its interest. I'm more interested in the what. So in your assessment, has the scope of Chinese interests changed the past decade? And at a broader level, do you see the same drivers for both the how, how they pursue these interests, and the what, the interests themselves? Do you see them as being driven by the same things as some of the factors you've identified? Or are Chinese interests sort of defined or driven by slightly different factors?
So I think the how and the what are always very closely connected. And by studying one, you could also say some things about the other and vice versa. They also have a tendency, of course, in the longer run to be mutually reinforcing in ways that we have already discussed. I mean, we talked about this with regard to language, but we also talk about it in terms of specific initiatives that is being taken, even domestically, within China on the how side. So I think with regard to, if we sort of interest base this in a broader sense with regard to foreign policy, I do see some signs. I probably see less than many others, but I do see some signs that there is an extension, even in a geographical sense, even a global sense, of some of these Chinese approaches to international affairs that I mentioned during my talk. I mean, if you look at the relationship to Australia, to India, to Europe, I do think that you see elements of a much more hardline Chinese policy, again along the lines that I described earlier on. You also see, and this is very interesting with regard to the connection between the hows and the whats, a willingness to set aside immediate economic self-interest on the Chinese side, which has not been that distinguishable, or certainly not prevalent, under previous administrations, previous party leaderships that I wanted to make their displeasure known. Right. So that's probably one of the connections that I see here in terms of some of this Chinese Xi Jinping, connect his name directly to it, approach to foreign policy sort of going global. But one should be very careful with concluding that means that you now have in a way a globalized Chinese foreign policy. I mean, more than ever, I see Chinese foreign policy as relentlessly focused on the region itself. And of course on the United States, which is a part of that region. Even in the relationship to Russia that we talked about earlier on, which is important for China, it is mainly how it plays itself out with regard to China's own immediate interests and its interest within the region that this matters. Right? We may be going through a period of change with regard to this. So, 10 years from now, I may turn out to have to be wrong then. Some people would then, of course, seek the origins of me being wrong in 2031 and what I'm saying about 2021. But I'm not so sure about it. I mean, I still think that the next decade overall, in terms of China's foreign policy, is going to be centered on its own wider region, with perhaps some changes, particularly in terms of economic policy, but in terms of security and political issues, mainly on the region.
So let's go back to the Zoom. Jim Walsh, over to you.
First of all, thank you so much for a useful and nuanced talk. And I had a foreign policy question about the region and then a small personal question that you can ignore if you want. But the personal about me, not about you. You talked about, the changes that differences in the last 10 years that have already been discussed, and those are internal to China. And then the other half of our conversation has been mostly in question and answer about the players in the region, Russia, Taiwan, Korea, Japan. We haven't talked about North Korea. It doesn't seem to me necessarily like the three changes you've identified as happening, though the significance of which we're not quite clear on, would necessarily have an impact on bilateral relations between the DPRK and China. But we do have a new development that with the US removing all missile limits in the ROK, we have a full-blown missile arms race on the peninsula. So I'm wondering, is it steady as she goes for China and North Korea, or is there are there any adjustments to be made? The personal thing is, you mentioned, and was quite interesting to me, you said that people, and I may have misheard, you said that people sort of overemphasize the authoritarian or personal aspect of Xi's rule. and I'm not someone who spends a lot of time on China. I am deeply ignorant, but as someone who just looks at the news occasionally about it, it seemed awfully authoritarian to me. And that is that, you saw the corruption, flies and tigers. That seemed like a power grab and consolidation from the outside. And you have this thing about, leader for life, which maybe that was mishandled by the press, but those two things look pretty darn authoritarian. So, but I'm guessing that's more subtle than that. And you talked about concerns about personalization of power in the Central Committee. So anything you want to add to that to help me understand that nuance a little better would be great.
I think, what I said earlier on is that he represents the party. He's a strong leader within the party, but he's not all powerful within the party or within China. Definitely authoritarian by all means. Also authoritarian in terms of increasingly authoritarian in terms of his leadership style within the party, except perhaps at the very top levels where he still has this strong reputation for being comradely. He's someone who does remember not just people's birthdays and anniversaries, but maybe even their children or their wives' birthdays, that kind of stuff. So authoritarian, absolutely more powerful than any leader of China since Deng Xiaoping, without any doubt, but not all powerful. So on the former question, I do see quite a bit of change with regard to North Korea. Some of which has to do with the worsening of Sino-American relations, and is a reflection of that, and of course the significant worsening of Sino-South Korean relations as well. A willingness to work with the North Koreans to a higher extent than I have seen before for a very long time. Even to the point of now, I just did a little book on Sino-Korean relations, and I was researching that in Beijing, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, to the point of taking the North Koreans seriously to an extent, as fellow communists and a fellow communist party, in a way that I haven't seen for a very long time. Certainly behind closed doors, the North Koreans tended in Beijing to be a laughingstock, up to quite recently. A laughingstock with nuclear weapons, yes, certainly, but that was seen more as a problem from the Chinese angle than anything that could be seen as strengthening China's overall position. Now this has gone through, at least with some people, a metamorphosis in the direction of actually starting to think meaningfully about North Korea as a Chinese ally, for the future. And the specific need, not just to defend North Korea, but to preserve the regime in its current form. So there has been quite a significant change. Maybe not surprising. I still don't think that it represents some kind of great love affair between the leadership groups in Beijing and Pyongyang at the personal level. But I do think that that's to some extent where we ended up, and that's of course significant. When things start to happen inside North Korea. So, it does worry me in that respect in terms of whether there are now people, and I think that is now the case, within the Chinese leadership who would think of the preservation of the Kim regime, not just the preservation of the North Korean state, but the preservation in very personal terms of the current leader in Pyongyang and the Kim regime as being a vital interest for China.
Wow. Great. So in the interest of being chair, I'd now like to ask a question, which I don't always do. But I want to go back to something you wrote 2 years ago about whether or not there's a Cold War between the US and China, if that was an appropriate way of looking at the way in which the relationship was evolving. And very interesting piece you had in Foreign Affairs. And I'm wondering, with the passage of time, 2 years of change in the dynamic, do you see the Cold War analogy as more apt than before, or even less apt than before, and why?
I don't see it as very apt at all, probably roughly at the same level as I did 2 years ago, Taylor. I not because, I mean, you know, it's a conceptual mix-up here is, of course, that there is a tendency in general parlance to talk about anything that is an intense conflict as being a Cold War, at least an intense conflict that lasts for a very long period of time. And that, in my view, obscures much more than it reveals about current US-China relationships, but also about the relationship that China has with the rest of the world. It's not necessarily better than the imagination of a Cold War kind relationship, but it's different. And it's different in terms of the kind of ideas and ideologies that are involved with regard to it. It's, of course, crucially, from my perspective, different in terms of me not believing that the world is becoming increasingly bipolar. I think the world in many ways is becoming increasingly multipolar, which is a basic distinction from how the Cold War world developed. So I still, maybe even more so actually now, Taylor, than I did 2 years ago, see other examples from history, if you want to use them, as more relevant to the US-China relationship and to China's foreign policy today. And the parallel that I see much more clearly now, I think, than I did 2 years ago, is the parallel with the late 19th century. A multipolar world with regional powers that increasingly strengthen their position, get increasingly preoccupied with their own interests in a relatively narrow sense, and with a global hegemon, in that case, the British Empire, that is slipping. So I'm not saying, I mean, this is not sort of a doomsday scenario where, you know, July 1914 is where we end up. I think one has to be very careful with saying that that is not necessarily the case. But many of the factors that are at play seems to me to be relatively similar. Now, one should also be careful, as I said in other contexts, not least discussing this with my political science friends, in making that parallel a kind of unique parallel. So most international systems tend in one way or another to be multipolar. It's quite rare to have a lasting bipolar international system. So that also means that the possibilities for actually managing multipolarity, at least up to a certain level, are there. Not all multipolar interstate competitions and the cataclysmic war. But I do think it is important to recognize that that is a much more straightforward, easier to understand, and therefore more meaningful parallel to what we are seeing today than any kind of lasting bipolar Cold War scenario.
Thanks, Arne. Very Posen.
Well, Arne, great talk, and I really enjoyed the back and forth, and I enjoyed the last few minutes because I kind of, like you, I find myself invoking the late 19th century, and I've been dredging up my history books from that period and trying to refresh my memory. I'm sorry, Steve Ever, I think he left the room, so he would answer the question better than I would, which is, but what about the parallels to at least one caricature of the Wilhelmines? And one caricature of the Wilhelmines is that they couldn't see the trouble that they caused, right? They had no ability to empathize with the parties that they threatened, with the people that they annoyed with their diplomacy. Now, it's true that, you know, they had a bad geographical position, but in some ways, so does China, right? And I've been struck in the last few years, and indeed even in the last few weeks, I've carried off a couple of Chinese officials at the, I'll mix my metaphors here, the tone deafness to the sounds coming from the other side, right? I thought you were sort of gentle in answering Nick's question. I actually think the Chinese are losing all over Asia right now, and they're our biggest ally these days, and they seem totally unaware of it, right? They just, and for reasons that you state, I think they're almost congenitally unable to realize the damage they're doing to their own cause, right? And I wonder, do you agree with that characterization? In other words, that they seem to have an inability to see that others' reactions are not simply the working out of an American conspiracy, but that are to some extent the result of their own behavior, their own expectations that people in the states in the region will, somehow yield to their superior power. I guess as a related question is, I am still not too sure what China's happy ending is for the region. In their minds, they allude to some Chinese dream or something. What is the dream for Asia? Right? Is the dream that the Americans withdraw to Hawaii and everybody else joins up some Chinese alliance? I mean, their objectives are unclear. And this was also shared with the Wilhelmines. So people kept looking at them and going, are they just bumptious and clumsy, or do they want to imperialize the whole region? Now, of course, there are other historical interpretations of the Wilhelmines, but for purposes of this question, we'll stick with this one. So I wonder what your reaction is to those two questions.
Those are great questions. Really good to see you. I do see parallels. I mean, I do see parallels with Wilhelmine Germany in particular. I also see clear comparisons with rising powers in general that tend to be pretty tone deaf with regard to their environments in general. I think you could possibly push the comparison with Germany a little bit further. There is an element of insecurity, which is very, very strong, as was the case in Germany in the after the Bismarck era. And there is, as you also quite correctly pointed out, there is uncertainty among its neighbors about what its actual aims are. And as you know better than me, when you get to the situation where war actually threatens, it's this all-consuming fear that is created by the uncertainty about what the actual aims are that leads us to disaster. So there are very striking parallels with regard to this. It could also, as one of my students pointed out in a discussion last week, being allied to a somewhat decrepit empire next door is not perhaps the best situation to be in if things really get difficult. So for those of us who still believe that Russia has a lot of decline in it, I think the parallel with the situation in Vienna prior to 1914 is not entirely far-fetched. So, yeah, I mean, there are reasons to worry along those lines. There are also differences. I think in terms of the leadership framework that has been established within the Chinese Communist Party, it is maybe remarkably, sometimes point out to people, if you draw the comparison with Wilhelmine Germany, you actually find, even in spite of it probably being significantly more authoritarian, the Chinese regime now than what was the case in Germany before 1914, you also find more checks in terms of different groups that will be pushing back, I think, with regard to engaging the rest of the world really in a road towards confrontation. We might not see that as much at the moment because the stakes are different and the issues are different as well. But I do think that one of the things that really went wrong in Germany in 1914 was that at the end of the day, you had a decision-making that was so hyper-centralized that it couldn't break out of its security predicament. As of yet, I mean, things are changing in China as we speak, but as of yet, even with the level of authoritarianism, of neo-authoritarianism that this leadership has introduced on the Chinese side, I don't quite see that yet. So, maybe that's a meager cause for hope, but it is one. The other issue, which is, I think, quite a crucial issue that a number of people have brought up in this discussion, is, of course, the relative perception of rise and decline. So I teach a class here at Yale this semester with Paul Kennedy on great power since the late 19th century, and will not surprise you that this issue does come up again and again. The problems with Germany in 1914 was that there were a number of leading figures, not the Kaiser himself, but people in the military and at the end of the day also in government, who argued that 1914 was Germany's maximum moment. that things wouldn't get better, then they would rather get worse. That Russia in 1914 was a power ascendant. Now, looking back at this, it's an argument that is hard to get, but it was certainly how things were seen among some people in Berlin in 1914. The same thing for Britain, the same thing for France, and certainly for the United States. So therefore, better act now when significant interest came under threat than postponing it. That I don't think is the case in China now. I mean, there is a narrative developed of China's irresistible rise, and that pushes in the direction of not developing the kind of particular Wilhelmine hysteria with regard to now or never. Again, a meager ground for hope, but it's one that might turn out to be important for all of us in the end.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arne. Sadly, we're out of time, but I think we've ended the seminar with a bang and not a whimper. So please join me in thanking Arne.
It was a great pleasure. Enjoyed it very much.
Thanks very much, Arne.
Thank you.